A week after I buried my husband of 40 years, my world was a quiet gray fog of grief. Then the doorbell rang and a woman half my age dressed in a blood-red suit stood on my porch. She held up 2 pieces of paper that were designed to incinerate my life. A marriage certificate with my husband's name on it, and a will that left me with nothing but the clothes on my back. She was his secret second wife and she had come to claim her inheritance. My home, my security, my entire history. She thought I was just a sad old widow she could discard. She had no idea I was a retired investigative journalist, and she had just become the most important and most foolish final story of my career. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Evelyn Reed. For 35 years I was an investigative journalist. This is the story of how the skills I used to uncover the hidden truths of my city were the only thing that could save me from the devastating lies of my own life. The week after we buried my husband, Richard, was a colorless fog of casseroles and condolences. The house, our house of 40 years, felt cavernous and silent, every familiar object a fresh, sharp-edged reminder of my loss. I was adrift, a ghost in my own life, navigating the strange, bureaucratic aftermath of death. The grief was a physical weight, a heavy cloak that muffled the world and made every simple task from making coffee to answering the phone feel like a monumental effort. It was in the middle of this fog on a Tuesday morning that the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find a woman standing on my porch, a woman who was a jarring slash of vibrant color in my gray, muted world. She was young, perhaps in her late 30s, and beautiful in a sharp, glossy, and vaguely predatory way. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored red suit, her nails were long and blood red, and she held a sleek, expensive-looking leather briefcase. "Evelyn Reed?" she asked, her voice as smooth and as polished as the designer handbag on her arm. "Yes," I said, my own voice a rusty and used thing. "My name is Tiffany Sterling," she said, and then she delivered the line that would detonate the foundations of my world. I was Richard's wife. I stared at her, my mind a blank, white, roaring static. The words did not compute. They were a random collection of sounds, a sentence from a language I did not understand. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my hand tightening on the doorknob. "I think you have the wrong house. My husband, Richard Reed, passed away last week." "I know," she said, her expression a careful, practiced mask of somber pity. "I was at the funeral. In the back. I didn't want to make a scene." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a crisp, official-looking document. "This might help to clarify things." He handed it to me. It was a marriage certificate, issued by the state of Nevada 5 years prior. The names on the certificate were Richard Reed and Tiffany Sterling. The world tilted on its axis. The solid ground beneath my feet seemed to dissolve into a dizzying, nauseating void. I looked from the certificate to her face and back again. It was a joke. It had to be a prank, a cruel, twisted, and deeply unfunny prank. "This is a fake," I whispered, the words a dry, rattling sound in my throat. "I assure you it is not," she said, her voice still maddeningly calm. "Richard and I were married for 5 years. He kept a condo in the city. It was our home." She then pulled a second document from her briefcase, a thick sheaf of papers bound in a blue legal cover. "And this," she said, her voice taking on a new, harder edge, "is his final will and testament. Signed and witnessed 3 months ago." He handed it to me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I flipped to the final page, and there was Richard's signature, the familiar, elegant, sloping script I had known for 45 years. And beneath it, a series of paragraphs that were as cold, as brutal, and as final as a death sentence. It stated in the driest possible legalese that he, Richard Reed, being of sound mind and body, left the entirety of his estate, his architecture firm, his investment portfolio, his personal effects, and the house, my house, the house I was currently standing in, to his beloved wife, Tiffany Sterling. My name, Evelyn Reed, his wife of 40 years, the mother of his children, the partner in his life, was not mentioned once. "As you can see," Tiffany said, her voice a low, triumphant purr, "Richard was very clear about his intentions. He wanted me to be taken care of. He wanted me to have everything." She gestured vaguely at the house behind me, a gesture of casual, proprietary ownership. "I know this must be a shock, and I want to make this transition as painless as possible. I'll give you a week to gather your personal belongings and make other arrangements. She was evicting me. From my own home. From my own life. She was a stranger. A beautiful, venomous snake who had just shed her skin and revealed herself to be the secret queen of my husband's hidden kingdom. And I, the old queen, the foolish, ignorant, and now utterly dispossessed queen, was being cast out into the cold. I stood there in the doorway of the home I had built, the life I had shared, and I felt the heavy cloak of grief transform into a shroud. I was not just a widow. I was a fool. A 40-year fool who had been living a lie, a beautiful, comfortable, and now spectacularly demolished lie. The shock was so total, so absolute, that it was beyond any emotion I had ever known. It was the quiet, terrifying calm at the center of a nuclear explosion. And in that calm, I heard a small, quiet, and deeply unfamiliar voice in the back of my mind. It was the voice of the woman I had been before I was a wife, before I was a mother. It was the voice of the investigative journalist. And it whispered a single dangerous and life-altering word: proof. The hours that followed Tiffany's visit were a blur of numb, mechanical motion. I remember making tea, my hands shaking so badly that the cup rattled in its saucer. I remember wandering the silent, familiar rooms of my home, touching the objects, the photographs, the furniture, as if they were artifacts in a museum of a life that was no longer mine. The grief for my husband was now a complicated, twisted thing, a Gordian knot of love and a profound, soul-shattering betrayal. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across my living room floor, I did the only thing I could think to do. I called my best friend, Angela Morrison. Angela and I had been friends for 40 years, our lives running on parallel tracks of professional ambition and personal loyalty. While I was chasing down stories and hidden truths as a journalist, she was chasing down criminals as a police detective. She was a sharp, tough, and deeply pragmatic woman who had seen the worst of human nature and had come out the other side with her sense of humor, and her nonsense detector fully intact. She had retired a few years ago, but the detective, the woman who could smell a lie from a mile away, was still very much alive. She answered on the first ring, her voice a warm, no-nonsense bark. "Evelyn, I was just about to call you. How are you holding up?" And then, the dam of my composure, the fragile, brittle wall of shock that had been holding me together, finally broke. The story came out in a torrent, a choked, broken, and barely coherent flood of words. I told her about the woman, the red suit, the marriage certificate, the will. I told her about the secret condo, the 5-year lie, the casual, brutal eviction notice. Angela listened, her silence not the silence of sympathy, but of a professional mind at work, gathering facts, assessing a crime scene. When I was finally finished, my voice a raw, ragged whisper, she did not offer condolences. She did not tell me everything would be okay. She said one simple and deeply, deeply satisfying word. "Bullshit," she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "What?" I stammered. "It's bullshit, Evelyn," she repeated, her voice now sharp, insistent. The voice of a detective who had just found the first crucial crack in a suspect's story. "The whole thing sinks. I've been a cop for 30 years. I've seen every kind of con, every kind of grift. This is too clean. A secret 5-year marriage? A perfect last-minute will that leaves everything to the new young wife and cuts out the wife of 40 years? A beautiful woman who shows up a week after the funeral, her legal ducks all in a row? This isn't a tragedy, Evelyn. This is a hustle." Her words were a jolt to my system, a blast of cold, clean, and beautifully cynical air that began to clear the fog of my grief. "But the documents, Angela," I said, my own voice still weak, still filled with doubt. "They looked real. The signature, it was his." "Of course it was his," she shot back. "These people are professionals. They don't make stupid mistakes. But that doesn't mean the story is true. It just means they're good at telling lies." She paused, and then her voice softened, but with a fierce, protective urgency. "Listen to me, Evelyn," she said. "You are not just a grieving widow. You are the best damned investigative journalist this city has ever seen. You taught me how to find the truth. You taught me how to follow the money, how to connect the dots, how to see the story that everyone else misses. So, you need to stop being a victim for a minute. And you need to start being a reporter." He was right. The words, the simple, powerful command were like a key, unlocking a part of myself I thought had died with my husband, a part of myself I had forgotten even existed. The journalist. The woman who did not accept the story she was given, but who went out and found the story that was real. Where do I start? I asked, my own voice a little stronger now, a flicker of the old, familiar fire beginning to burn in the ashes of my grief. You start where you always start, she said, her voice now the voice of a partner, a co-conspirator. You start with the money. You pull every bank statement, every credit card bill, every financial record you can find for the last 5 years. You build a timeline. You look for the anomalies, the inconsistencies, the lies. Richard was a creature of habit. His money will tell you his secrets. You follow the money, Evelyn. You follow the money, and I promise you it will lead you to the truth. I hung up the phone, my heart a steady, powerful drum in my chest. The grief was still there, a deep, resonant ache. But it was now joined by a new, powerful and deeply familiar emotion. It was the thrill of the hunt. The game was afoot. And I, Evelyn Reed, was no longer just the widow. I was the lead investigator on the most important and most personal story of my entire life. My investigation began the next morning, not in the back alleys of the city, but at my own dining room table. I had transformed the space, the site of so many happy family memories, into a makeshift war room. I had boxes of old financial records, bank statements, credit card bills, tax returns, a 40-year history of a life I now knew to be a lie. It was a painful and deeply necessary, archaeological dig into the ruins of my own marriage. I started with the last 5 years, the period of Tiffany's alleged secret marriage. I laid the credit card statements out in chronological order, a paper trail of my husband's life. At first it was a familiar, comforting landscape. The charges for our favorite restaurants, for the hardware store he loved, for the subscriptions to his architectural magazines. It was the mundane, beautiful poetry of a shared life. And then I found the first anomaly. A charge 4.5 years ago for a dinner at a ridiculously expensive, trendy new restaurant downtown. I remembered the night vividly. It was our anniversary. He had taken me there, we had drunk champagne, and he had told me, his eyes shining with what I had believed to be a sincere and uncomplicated love, that I was the only woman he had ever and would ever love. But then as I scanned the rest of the statement for that month, I found another charge. From the same restaurant. For a nearly identical and equally exorbitant amount. Just 1 week later. It was a dinner I had not been at. A dinner I had known nothing about. The discovery was a small, sharp and deeply personal betrayal. It was the first concrete and irrefutable piece of evidence that the story I had told myself about my life was a fiction. I kept digging. And the anomalies, the inconsistencies, the secret expenditures, began to form a pattern, a shadow life lived in the margins of our own. There were hotel bills for hotels in our own city. There were charges from high-end designer boutiques I had never set foot in, for women's clothes that were not my size and not my style. There were airline tickets for trips to Las Vegas and Miami, trips he had told me were business conferences, but which I now saw in a new and deeply sinister light. With each new discovery, a piece of my own cherished memory was corroded, was tainted. The husband I had known, the steady, reliable and deeply loving man I had shared my life with, was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a stranger, a man of secrets and lies, a man who had lived a life I had been completely and devastatingly blind to. The work was slow, methodical and emotionally brutal. But it was also familiar. It was the work I had done for 35 years. It was the process of taking a mountain of chaotic information and finding the narrative, the hidden truth within it. The grief was still there, a constant low-grade hum of pain, but it was now joined by a new and powerful and deeply focusing emotion. The cold, clean and deeply satisfying rage of a reporter who knows she is on the verge of breaking a very big and very personal story. I was building a case, a secret, private and deeply damning portfolio of my husband's betrayal. I was following the money just as Angela had told me to. And it was leading me down a dark and twisted and deeply painful path. But it was a path that I knew, with the unshakable certainty of a seasoned investigator, would ultimately lead me to the truth. And the truth, I was beginning to realize, was the only thing that could set me free. My next step was to face the legal reality of my situation. I made an appointment with Benjamin Carter, the man who had been our family lawyer for over 30 years. Benjamin was a kind, decent and deeply honorable man, a man who had helped us with everything from the purchase of our first home to the drafting of our first wills. He had been a friend to both me and Richard. And I knew that the news I was about to deliver would be as much of a shock and a betrayal, to him as it had been to me. I sat in his quiet, book-lined office, a place that had always been a source of comfort and security, and I laid out the story. I showed him a copy of the Nevada marriage certificate. I showed him a copy of the new devastating will. And I watched as the color drained from his face, his expression a mixture of profound shock and a deep, professional horror. "I don't understand," he stammered, his voice a low, incredulous whisper. He stared at the documents as if they were alien artifacts, objects that simply could not and should not exist in his well-ordered, logical world. "Richard, a second wife? For 5 years? It's impossible. I spoke to him just 4 months ago. We reviewed his estate plan. His will, the one I drafted, the one that leaves everything to you, is still on file, right here in my office. And yet," I said, my own voice a quiet, tired thing, "this new one exists. And it has his signature." Benjamin spent the next hour on the phone, his voice a low, urgent murmur as he spoke to the probate court, to the county clerk's office in Nevada, to a network of legal contacts he had built over a lifetime. He was a man on a mission, a man trying to find a flaw, a loophole, a mistake, anything that would make this nightmare go away. But when he finally hung up the phone, his face was a mask of grim and deeply reluctant defeat. "The marriage certificate is legal and valid," he said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that was both personal and professional. "Nevada's laws are flexible. And the new will has been filed with the probate court by Ms. Sterling's attorney. On the surface, Evelyn, I have to be honest with you, it appears to be ironclad." The words, the legal, final, and seemingly inescapable truth of them, landed like a physical blow. The small, fragile flicker of hope that Angela's words had ignited in me was now in danger of being extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the law. "So, what does that mean?" I asked, my voice a barely audible whisper. "It means," he said, his own voice filled with a deep and genuine anguish, "that we are in for the fight of our lives. Tiffany Sterling, as his legal and most recent spouse, has a powerful claim. The new will, which postdates the one I have on file, will be seen by the court as his final and most current intention. We can contest it, of course. We can argue undue influence. We can argue that he was not of sound mind, but these are difficult, expensive, and deeply uncertain battles to fight." He leaned forward, his expression a mask of profound and deeply reluctant sympathy. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a gentle, terrible whisper, "I have to be honest with you. The legal presumption will be on her side. You need to prepare yourself for the very real possibility that you could lose everything. The company, the investments, even the house." I left his office that day feeling a chill so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to have settled in my very bones. I was not just a grieving widow anymore. I was not just a betrayed wife. I was a defendant, a litigant, a woman who was about to be stripped of her home, her security, her entire 40-year history by a stranger with a piece of paper. The world, which had already been tilted on its axis, now seemed to be in a full and catastrophic freefall. I was at the mercy of a legal system that was designed to follow the letter of the law, not the spirit of a life. And the letter of the law, as it stood, was a love letter to a woman who was not me. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a flicker of genuine and terrifying despair. I felt the urge to give up, to surrender, to walk away from the fight and let the vultures have the bones of my life. I had, in that moment, almost lost everything. But the key word, the one that would become my mantra, my lifeline, my reason to keep fighting, was almost. The journalist in me, the stubborn, relentless, and deeply underestimated woman who had spent a lifetime digging for the truth, was not dead yet. And she was about to get her second wind. The feeling of despair, as profound as it was, did not last. It was burned away by the cold, clean fire of a reporter's rage. I was not a woman who surrendered. I was a woman who dug. And so I began to dig with a focus, a determination, and a methodical, relentless precision that had been the hallmark of my entire professional life. My first target was the secret condo, the place Tiffany had so casually and so cruelly referred to as our home. I used my old and not entirely legal access to a series of online databases, the tools of my trade that I had never quite managed to give up, and I found it within an hour. It was a sleek, modern, and ridiculously expensive apartment in a new glass and steel high-rise downtown, a building that was the architectural opposite of the warm, historic, and deeply personal home Richard and I had shared. I ran a title search on the property. It had been purchased 5 years ago, right around the time of the alleged secret marriage. And it had been purchased by a shell corporation, a legal entity with a generic, meaningless name. But the registered agent of that corporation, the name on the official public documents, was my husband, Richard Reed. I then subpoenaed, through Benjamin's office, the utility bills, the maintenance records, the parking garage logs for the building. And the paper trail began to paint a picture, a detailed and deeply sordid portrait of my husband's secret life. There were bills for extravagant flower arrangements, for cases of expensive champagne, for a high-end cleaning service that came twice a week. There were parking garage records that showed his car, the car he told me was always parked at his downtown office, entering and leaving the condo's private garage at all hours of the day and night. It was a life of luxury, of secrecy, of a casual and deeply expensive infidelity. And it was all funded by the profits from the architecture firm that I, his wife, had helped him build. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was financial. He had been siphoning money from our shared life to fund his secret one for years. While I was digging into the past, Tiffany was launching a full-scale assault on my present. The letters from her lawyer began to arrive, a steady, relentless drip of legal intimidation. They were formal, cold, and brutal. They demanded that I provide a full accounting of all of Richard's personal assets. They demanded that I turn over the keys to his classic car, a vehicle he and I had restored together. And they reiterated, in the starkest possible terms, that I was to vacate my home within the week. She was not waiting for the court to decide. She was acting as if she had already won. She was a bully, a predator, and she was trying to intimidate me into submission. She then made her next and most audacious move. She went to our bank, the bank where Richard and I had a large joint savings account, an account that held our emergency fund, our life savings. She presented her marriage certificate, her will, and a death certificate, and she had the account frozen. I found out when I tried to pay my property taxes and my debit card was declined. The humiliation, the sheer public powerlessness of that moment, was a new and deeply personal violation. She was not just trying to take my future, she was trying to dismantle my present, piece by painful piece. But her aggression, her arrogance, her supreme and ultimately foolish overconfidence was a mistake. It did not intimidate me. It did not make me want to surrender. It did the opposite. It fueled my rage. It sharpened my focus. It made me a better reporter. Every letter from her lawyer, every new act of financial aggression, was another piece of evidence, another entry in the file I was building against her. She thought she was winning the war. She had no idea that she was just providing me with the ammunition I would need to win the final, decisive battle. The more she pushed, the more I dug. And I knew, with the unshakable certainty of an investigator who has just caught the scent of a lie, that I was getting closer and closer to the one single hidden truth that would bring her entire fraudulent world crashing down around her. The breakthrough came, as it so often does, not in a moment of high drama, but in the quiet late-night stillness of my own home. I was at a dead end. I had a mountain of evidence that proved my husband had been living a secret, duplicitous life. I had proof of his affair, of his financial infidelity. But I had nothing, not a single concrete piece of evidence, that could legally challenge the validity of that final, devastating will. I had a powerful story of a moral crime, but I had no case for a legal one. In a moment of pure, frustrated exhaustion, I reverted to the most fundamental, most old-fashioned tool of my trade. I cleared the entire dining room table, the one that had been buried under a mountain of financial records, and I got out a giant corkboard and a box of pushpins. I was going to build a timeline. For the next 2 days I did nothing else. I became a human data processor, a machine for organizing the chaotic, messy details of a life into a single coherent narrative. I pinned up every document, every piece of evidence I had. There were credit card statements, hospital records, airline tickets, restaurant receipts, his personal and professional calendars, my own journals. I created a massive, sprawling, and deeply, deeply painful visual representation of the last 5 years of my marriage. I used different colored strings to connect the dots. A red string for his secret life with Tiffany, the condo, the trips, the secret dinners. A blue string for our life together, our anniversaries, our vacations, the quiet, mundane, and now heartbreakingly poignant details of our shared history. The board was a chaotic, beautiful, and terrible spiderweb, a cat's cradle of love and lies. I would stand back and stare at it for hours, my mind searching for a pattern, a mistake, a single loose thread that, if I pulled it, would unravel the entire rotten tapestry. And then, on the third night at 2 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by the ghosts of my own life, I found it. It was not a dramatic smoking gun. It was a small, quiet, and almost insignificant detail. It was a conflict of dates, a simple logistical impossibility that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The will, the one that left everything to Tiffany, was dated and signed on March 12th of that year. I had the document, a notarized copy from the probate court, pinned to the board. And I had, for weeks, been so focused on the signature, on the devastating words, that I had paid almost no attention to the date. But now, as I scanned my timeline, my eyes tracing the chaotic web of strings, my gaze fell on another document, pinned just a few inches away. It was a hospital record, a discharge summary from a minor, but not insignificant medical procedure Richard had undergone in the spring. He had had a small benign tumor removed from his back. It was a simple outpatient procedure, but it had required general anesthesia. And the date of that procedure, the date he had gone into the hospital in the morning and had come home groggy, disoriented, and heavily sedated in the afternoon, was March 12th. I stared at the two documents, my heart a sudden wild and triumphant drum in my chest. He could not have been in two places at once. He could not have been at a lawyer's office of sound mind and body, signing a complex legal document, on the same day he was recovering from surgery, his mind a fog of anesthetic and painkillers. It was impossible. The signature on the will was his. I had no doubt of that. But the context, the timeline, the simple, irrefutable, and medically documented facts of that day, proved that he could not have been legally competent when he had signed it. I traced the red string from the will and the blue string from the hospital record, and I saw where they intersected. It was the weak point. It was the lie. It was the single loose thread I had been searching for. And I knew with a certainty that was as bright and as clear as the morning sun that was just beginning to creep through my windows, that if I pulled on that thread, Tiffany Sterling's entire fraudulent world was about to unravel. The moment I found the discrepancy, the entire emotional atmosphere of my life shifted. The grief, the rage, the despair, all of it was burned away by the clean, white-hot and deeply, deeply satisfying fire of a reporter who has just broken the case. I was no longer a victim. I was an investigator who had just found her smoking gun. I called Benjamin Carter at dawn, my voice a low, urgent, and triumphant whisper. I didn't wait for him to get to the office. I called his private line. "Benjamin," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. "I've got it. I've got the proof." I explained the timeline, the hospital record, the logistical impossibility of the will's signing. He listened, his silence a testament to his own dawning and deeply professional excitement. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, incredulous whistle. "If this is true, if you can prove he was medically incompetent on that date, this changes everything. This isn't just a case of undue influence anymore. This is a case of demonstrable, provable fraud." My next call was to Angela. She was, as always, my partner, my strategist, my co-conspirator. I laid out the evidence and she immediately understood the tactical implications. "The witnesses," she said, her voice sharp, a detective already planning her interrogation. "The will had to be witnessed. Who were they?" I had the names, of course, from the notarized copy of the will. Two names I did not recognize. Angela, with her old and not entirely dormant network of contacts in the police department, ran a background check. It took her less than an hour. The witnesses were not lawyers or professionals. They were two of Tiffany's friends, a yoga instructor and a struggling actress. "Amateurs," Angela had snorted with a deep professional contempt. "This is our leverage. These women are not going to want to perjure themselves in a multi-million-dollar fraud case. They are not going to want to go to prison for their rich friend." And so, the three of us, the journalist, the lawyer, and the detective, went to work. We became a three-person task force, a private and deeply motivated investigative unit dedicated to a single simple goal: the complete and total annihilation of Tiffany Sterling's case. Benjamin filed a motion with the probate court, formally challenging the validity of the will on the grounds of the testator's lack of capacity. He subpoenaed Richard's full medical records, the anesthesiologist's report, the hospital's visitor logs. He was building a mountain of irrefutable medical evidence. Angela meanwhile did what she did best. She paid a visit to the two witnesses. He did not threaten them. He did not intimidate them. She simply, and with the calm, terrifying authority of a career police detective, laid out the facts. She explained the medical evidence. She explained the legal definition of perjury. She explained the sentencing guidelines for felony fraud. And then she made them an offer. A one-time get-out-of-jail-free card. They could sign a sworn affidavit, telling the truth about what had really happened on March 12th, or they could take their chances with the district attorney. Their story, as Angela had predicted, crumbled within minutes. They admitted that Richard had not been at a lawyer's office. He had been at Tiffany's condo in his bed, groggy and disoriented. Tiffany had told them it was just a simple document, a power of attorney, something to allow her to pay his bills while he was recovering. She had guided his hand as he had signed it. They had witnessed a signature, but they had not witnessed a man of sound mind and body making a clear and conscious decision. They had been used. And they were, now that they understood the legal jeopardy they were in, more than willing to say so under oath. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. We had the medical evidence. We had the timeline. And now, we had the sworn testimony of the witnesses. A confession that turned our case from a strong probability into an absolute, unshakable certainty. The trap was set. The evidence was gathered. The weapons were locked and loaded. It was time to summon the enemy to the field of battle. It was time for the final and most satisfying act of the war. It was time for the reckoning. The summons was delivered not as a threat, but as an invitation. Benjamin Carter sent a polite and deeply misleading letter to Tiffany's lawyer. It stated that his client, Evelyn Reed, in the interest of avoiding a long, painful and expensive court battle, was prepared to discuss a settlement. It requested a meeting at his office to resolve all outstanding matters in a spirit of amicable compromise. It was a beautiful, perfect, and utterly disingenuous piece of legal theater. And Tiffany, in her supreme and ultimately fatal arrogance, took the bait. She and her lawyer arrived at Benjamin's office on a Tuesday morning, striding into the conference room with the smug, confident air of victors arriving to accept the formal surrender of their defeated foe. They were not prepared for what they saw. They were expecting to see me, a small, broken and desperate old woman, ready to beg for a few scraps from the table of my own life. They were not expecting to see me, sitting at the head of a massive, polished boardroom table flanked by my best friend, a retired police detective with a gaze as cold and as hard as steel, and my lawyer, a man who was radiating an aura of calm, lethal and deeply satisfied competence. And they were certainly not expecting to see the massive corkboard timeline, my terrible, beautiful and deeply incriminating work of art, which I had insisted on having brought to the office and which now stood in the corner of the room like a silent, unassailable witness. Tiffany's confident stride faltered. A flicker of confusion, of uncertainty, crossed her face. She sat down, her posture a little too rigid, her smile a little too bright. Benjamin began the meeting, his voice a quiet, measured and utterly emotionless purr. He did not make accusations. He simply stated facts. "We are here today," he began, "to discuss the will of the late Richard Reed dated March 12th. He slid a thin folder across the table. "In this folder, you will find the full, certified medical records from Mr. Reed's surgical procedure on that date, including the anesthesiologist's report, which clearly states that he was under the influence of powerful sedatives for a full 24 hours following the procedure." He slid a second folder across the table. "In this folder you will find the sworn, notarized affidavits of the two witnesses to that will, in which they state, under penalty of perjury, that they witnessed Mr. Reed sign the document while he was at home in his bed, and in a state of obvious disorientation." He slid a third and final folder across the table. "And in this folder," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, "you will find a draft of the criminal complaint we are prepared to file with the district attorney's office this afternoon, charging your client, Ms. Sterling, with multiple counts of felony fraud, forgery, and conspiracy." He leaned back in his chair, his work done. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Tiffany's lawyer's ragged, panicked breathing as he frantically read the documents. Tiffany just sat there, her face a pale, ghastly, and beautiful mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. The entire foundation of her world, the legal, financial, and moral high ground she had been so certain she occupied, had just been vaporized in a matter of minutes. She was no longer the grieving widow, the rightful heir. He was a criminal. A fraud. A foolish, greedy, and now utterly cornered con artist. "My client," Benjamin continued, his voice now the voice of a man dictating the terms of an unconditional surrender, "is a generous woman. She has no desire to see you in prison. And so she is prepared to offer you a one-time and non-negotiable deal. You will sign this document." He slid a single piece of paper across the table, "in which you renounce any and all claims to the estate of Richard Reed. You will withdraw the fraudulent will from the probate court. You will walk out of this office, out of this city, and out of my client's life forever. And in return she will not press criminal charges." He stood up, a gesture of final, absolute dismissal. "You have 1 hour to decide," he said. "I suggest you use it wisely." And with that he, Angela, and I stood up and we walked out of the room, leaving her and her lawyer alone with the wreckage of her lies. The reckoning was complete. The war was over. And we had in the end won. The aftermath was a quiet and deeply satisfying denouement. Tiffany, of course, signed the document. She had no choice. She and her lawyer scurried out of Benjamin's office an hour later, their faces pale and drawn, and she disappeared from my life as suddenly and as mysteriously as she had appeared. I never saw or heard from her again. She was a ghost, a bad dream, a painful and now finally closed chapter in the story of my life. With the fraudulent will withdrawn, the original valid will, the one that left everything to me, was executed without a problem. I was once again the sole, undisputed, and legal heir to the life and the legacy my husband and I had built together. But the victory felt hollow, tainted. The architecture firm, the business that had been the source of our wealth and our pride, was now, in my eyes, a monument to my husband's lies. I could no longer look at it without feeling the sting of his betrayal. And so I made a decision. I sold it. I sold the company, the building, the brand, all of it. I was not interested in being the steward of a legacy that was, for me, a painful and complicated memory. I was interested in building a new one. I took the considerable fortune from the sale of the firm, and from the rest of Richard's estate, and I did something that was entirely my own. I established a foundation. It was not a grand, self-aggrandizing institution. It was a small, focused, and deeply personal project. It was called the Reed Foundation for Journalistic Integrity, and its mission was to provide grants, fellowships, and legal support to young female investigative reporters who were working on difficult, dangerous, and underfunded stories. It was my way of honoring the woman I had been, the woman I had, in the fog of my grief and my betrayal, almost forgotten. It was my way of taking the pain of my own story and transforming it into a tool, a weapon, a source of empowerment for a new generation of women who, like me, were dedicated to digging for the truth. The story ends not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office, but in the quiet, familiar stillness of my own home. My home, which was and always had been mine. I was sitting at my old, worn, and deeply beloved desk, the place where I had written 1,000 stories, uncovered 1,000 secrets. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The massive corkboard timeline, my terrible, beautiful work of art, still stood in the corner of the room. I had not had the heart to take it down. It was a reminder, a testament, a map of the long, dark, and ultimately triumphant journey I had just completed. I rolled a fresh sheet of paper into my old manual typewriter, the one I had used for my entire career, and I began to write. I was not writing a story about a corrupt politician or a corporate scandal or a hidden crime. I was writing a new story. My story. A story of love, of loss, of betrayal, and of the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who had been underestimated, who had been wronged, and who had, in the end, used the one tool she had always trusted, the truth, to reclaim her own life. The byline, for the first time in a very long time, was my own. And the story, I knew, was just beginning.